Homer's Odyssey is one of the greatest stories ever told. But what if I told you the locations in it are real? I'm Curtis Holland, and I'm an independent historian who studies ancient history, ancient texts, and ancient symbolism through a scientific and first principles lens. And today, we're going to continue our conversation on the Odyssey, specifically the locations of Odysseus' travel and how they fit into our historical timeline. So what did Homer actually know? I promised you in our last video that I would discuss the specific locations that he has Odysseus travel on his way back from Anatolia to Greece. Now, if you were to take a look at a map, Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, is not a 10-year sail from Greece. Yet Homer has Odysseus traveling all across the Mediterranean, facing many trials and tribulations. Some of those are brought about by the gods. Some of those are brought about by Odysseus and his men's own hubris. But that begs the question, what's the point of a long drawn-out journey for a sail that you could functionally accomplish in days in antiquity? This brings us back to Strabo, the author we spoke about in our last video, specifically his first book on geography. In it, he makes the claim that Homer is the first geographer and that each location on this journey encodes to a real place, and he goes through them line by line, discussing exactly how he was able to determine where each location was in the real world. And this process becomes his default in assessing ancient myths and texts in order to find the locations as he builds his own geography. And as I mentioned before, Strabo became one of, if not the most cited ancient geographers when it comes to modern archaeologists and historians. This means that implicitly, the foundational geography of the ancient world, the world we claim to understand now, was built on top of a method employed by the ancient poet Homer. So what is the method? Well, let's do what Strabo did. Let's take a look at the book and examine some of the locations of Odysseus' journey. Now, I'm not going to include every location in the Odyssey, as that would make this a 1-hour video, but I am going to try to follow the basic order of events. And spoilers for a 3,000-year-old text. If you haven't read it by now, I don't know what to tell you. Let's start with Troy. We've already touched on this. Troy, the city that everyone said was invented right until someone took it seriously and put a shovel in the ground. Real place, real war. The text was right, and that's the starting line. Now let's see where the voyage goes. One of the first stops in the journey is the Lotus Eaters. In the poem, Odysseus' men eat the lotus fruit and forget everything. They forget home, forget the mission, they just want to stay and eat. That sounds like pure fantasy. Except the Lotus Eaters weren't invented by Homer. The Greeks called them the Lotophagi. They were a real people in a real place. Herodotus, another ancient Greek historian, describes them in his histories. They were living on the Libyan coast, eating a real fruit for which they got their name. The fruit itself has been identified as the wild jujube, a thorny shrub with a berry sweet like a date that they ate year-round and even made wine from. It was a real staple crop for the people living there. But here's the thing, nobody forgets home eating jujubes. However, the Egyptian blue lotus, growing in the same corner of the world, was known to cause minor psychedelic effects and was widely consumed in antiquity before itself vanishing from the Nile. And Herodotus isn't just passing along legend here. He's talking about a real people group, one the Greeks actually knew and met and had established trade relationships with. Pliny the Elder, another ancient historian, puts them in the exact same region centuries later. And Strabo gives you that location exactly. An island called Menonix, which is now called Djerba off the coast of North Africa in the Gulf of Gabes. And so, notice what we have. You have a real people in a real place eating a real fruit on a real coastline that you can go to today. And that's how mythology works. Tell a real story and embellish it a little bit to make it interesting. Now hold on to the Gulf of Gabes. We're going to be coming back to it. Next, the island home of the Cyclops. The one-eyed man-eating giant Polyphemus, who traps Odysseus in his cave. And of course, this is the story everyone remembers. And it's also the part that sounds the most made up. So what do we do with this? Well, let's start with the text, because Homer doesn't hand you a fairy tale island. He hands you sailing directions, a harbor that you can run a ship straight into without tying it off, a freshwater spring at the head of it, a soft, well-watered meadow, a wooded island full of wild goats lying just offshore. And that doesn't read like literary invention, it reads like a real coastline that someone actually saw.
So where is it?
Well, Strabo puts it in southeast Sicily, the country around Mount Etna and Leontini, real geography.
And in the same breath, he locates another people group right next door, the Laestrygonians.
The cannibals who smashed Odysseus' fleet with boulders.
And Strabo isn't reaching here. He's drawing on real ancient scholarship from the time.
Thucydides, a hard-nosed Greek historian known for intentionally stripping myth out of his own history, was writing 400 years before Strabo even got a hold of this story.
In it, he makes the claim that the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians are real people groups, not monsters, and they're the oldest occupying the island. Now, he does say that he cannot vouch for who they were culturally or specifically, but the placement's already ancient even in his time. So here's Strabo's claims.
2 hostile populations in a real Sicilian territory, the kind of coast a Greek sailor had every reason to avoid, a sort of Bronze Age North Sentinel island.
And that tracks, as the late Bronze Age was known to have many people groups actively hostile to foreigners.
Homer just takes the extra step and turns them into giants, embellishes the encounter, and keeps the real history underneath.
Now that's all fine and dandy, I hear you say, but here's the question. What about the one eye? Well, here we find Homer's not immune to literary borrowing. He turns to the north, to a people group called the Arimaspians. This was a Scythian legend of a people group known to have one eye, recorded in a poem by Aristeus called the Arimaspia. The Greeks had really creative names for their poetry.
And Strabo's read is that Homer borrowed the one-eye motif, a one-eyed people that the Greeks already knew, and mapped it into a real hostile people in Sicily.
And it works because that legend is already well known. The audience hears one eye and immediately understands the type of people they're dealing with.
Homer isn't building a monster from scratch. He's using shorthand his listeners already had.
Odysseus and his crew then go on to meet the king Aeolus, the wind god who governs the Aeolian islands. In the poem, he hands Odysseus a leather bag with a silver drawstring that contains all of the winds that he would need to find his way back home. Which obviously sounds like pure myth, a man who controls the weather. But again, here we see a real place beneath the myth. Aeolus governed the Lipari Islands, the Aeolian archipelago just north of Sicily. The islands still carry that name today. But it's the next part that matters, and Strabo tells you exactly how a man can become a wind god. Aeolus taught men how to navigate those waters. The currents there are brutal, and they run with the tides. Getting through alive depends on timing them right. And Aeolus knew how to read them. And for that, the locals dubbed him the Keeper of the Winds. Now, if you're an ancient traveler on the deck of a ship and didn't know any better, a man who can reliably predict the currents in the winds looks like a man who can control them. You see, the bag of winds isn't magic. It's simply the knowledge of how to navigate difficult waters in a boat. And this is exactly the type of information that Strabo proposes gets compressed into looking like the knowledge of a god. And that's not a one-off. That's the entire idea of mythic compression. And then here Strabo quotes Polybius, another ancient Greek historian. He explains that Danis, foundational as one of the first Greek kings, was deified for being the one to find reservoirs of water underneath the city of Argos. And then another king, Atreus, became deified because he was the one who taught the Greeks that the sun moved in an opposite direction to the stars around the heavens. Both of these two were appointed kings in antiquity per the legends, and both of them were remembered as deified figures in Greek mythology. And here Strabo makes an even more powerful claim. In every god we worship, we're really honoring the person who discovered something useful. Somebody knows something real, how to read the sea, where the water is, how the sky moves. And across enough generations, the knowledge gets remembered as a person. And that person gets remembered as a god. The myth being the container of forgotten knowledge. However, not every divine character encodes cleanly into real people. Some demonstrate the dangers of real locations. Circe, the witch who turns Odysseus' men into pigs, and the Sirens, whose song captures the hearts of weary travelers, bewitching them into crashing on the rocks. So what do these allegories mean? And it's quite simple. The Mediterranean is dangerous. There are many coastlines that are so beautiful, yet so deadly that sailors would wreck themselves trying to reach them. These characters represent what it feels like to be pulled toward a beautiful coastline after a long time at sea. But unfortunately, without the knowledge of how to traverse these areas, it is often incredibly dangerous. The Greeks placed Circe's island on the Italian coast, at a cape that still carries her name, Monte Circeo. The Sirens had a home too, a stretch of the Italian coast that the natives called Sirensuse, and an island called Nicosia, which was named after the Sirens. Anyone who's ever been to the Amalfi Coast in Italy knows how beautiful that coastline is. Yet some of these coastlines are the most perilous in the entire Mediterranean. These aren't free-floating fairy tales. They're fixed to real places on real maps, the same as every other location on the journey. The danger was real, the poetry is just how you remember it. And while some may say that the names of these locations came from the myth, many of these names were already ancient by the time of the ancient Greek historians, and it's unclear whether or not those names can be attributed specifically to Homer or if they predate his epics. And so now we come to another strange location on the journey, the land of the dead. Odysseus sails to the edge of the world, to a place of permanent fog and darkness, where the sun never shines, and there he speaks with the souls of the dead. The people who live at that dark edge are called the Cimmerians, and that's Cimmerian with a C, not Sumerian. Now, the location of the underworld is obviously a myth, but the Cimmerians were anything but. They were a real people from far north up around the Black Sea, often called the Pontus or the Euxine. And Strabo makes a point of this. Homer didn't just know the name of the Cimmerians, he knew them. Around Homer's lifetime, or perhaps just before it, the Cimmerians came down out of the north and ravaged their way across the land, all the way into Ionia, into the Greek world itself. The Greek chroniclers preserve this. This is a real people, hostile and foreign to the Greeks. Their existence also shows up in the records of the Neo-Assyrian Empire as the Gemiri, starting in the late 8th century BC. What's more, there's contemporary correspondence to Sargon II's court reporting that the Cimmerians had crushed the kingdom of Urartu around 714 BC. So then why does Homer place these people at the gates of Hades? And the answer is rather straightforward. Because the homeland of the Cimmerians is the North Caucasus region, at the edge of the Greek known map. Beyond them are the vast steppes of Russia and Asia, uncharted lands and borderline uninhabitable to a Bronze Age population. It was a colder, wetter, and darker climate year-round in comparison to the Greek Mediterranean. But perhaps most importantly, these people were alien to the Greeks. They were different. They had different traditions, different customs, and different gods. They were the perfect metaphor for the land of the dead, the land of people functionally living in another world. And that cognitive dissonance was perfect for the motif that Homer was going for. Which brings us to our next location, Scylla and Charybdis.
The two monsters guarding a narrow strait. On one side, the six-headed creature reaching out to snatch men off the deck, and on the other side, a whirlpool that swallows ships whole. And by now you should know where this is going. It's a real strait, the Strait of Messina, the narrow gap between Sicily and the Italian mainland. And the danger there is real. This is where the two seas meet, the Tyrian on one side and the Ionian on the other. Their tides don't line up. So the water tears through that narrow channel, and it reverses twice a day. Now remember that number, twice a day. That reversal is what spins up the whirlpools.
And that's Charybdis.
The same currents Aeolus taught the sailors to read, a genuine ship-threatening whirlpool, in the exact spot that Homer puts one.
And then there's Scylla, the six-headed monster lunging off the rocks to snatch weary travelers. Polybius, again preserved by Strabo, makes the claim that this is a swordfish hunt, native to that exact region.
And he describes how it's done. A lookout posted on the cliff, two-man boats, one to row and one with a barbed spear, something waiting at the rock, lunging out to seize prey from the sea. And the thing from the sea is the swordfish, and the monster is the men hunting it. And swordfish hunting is one of the most dangerous kinds of fishing in the ancient world. They often compared it to hunting boar. And Homer turned that fishing ground into a monster, so that both monsters decode to real things at one real place.
But here's an interesting control. Homer says Charybdis churns 3 times a day. In reality, the Strait of Messina only has a tide 2 times a day. And Strabo flags it, as he's been to the Strait of Messina and counted it. So this is a good question. How do we know that this is the location that Homer meant? And the answer to that is incredibly simple and rather mundane. because there's no place on Earth where the tide rises 3 times a day.
It's not the tides that anchor that location. It's the rest of the textual clues that give you everything else. The strait is real. The whirlpool is real. The rock is real. The swordfish hunt is real. The only thing that's off is a single number. And that's the tell of mythic compression. You see, the structure of that, independently identifying everything else and mislabeling one number, that's not what literary invention looks like. That's what memory looks like.
And that's Strabo's whole argument. If Homer had invented Scylla and Charybdis, then there's zero reason why the rest of the data would match so cleanly with just the tides being off. Which brings us to our last location, the one Strabo couldn't solve. Ogygia, the island at the center of the sea, where the sea goddess Calypso keeps Odysseus prisoner for 7 years until he's finally allowed to go home. Up until this point, all of these locations had been identified and accounted for by the ancient historians. But this one, Strabo reads as pointing out somewhere past the edge of the known world. He believes it's out in the open ocean, beyond where anyone lives. Actually, that sounds a little bit like another mythical island. But here we run into a problem, and so Strabo turned to Polybius again, who did the most honest thing any scholar can do. He ran the numbers. Odysseus builds a raft and sails for 17 days to get to the islands of the Phaeacians. Based on the location of the Phaeacians, the distance to the Atlantic Ocean could not be covered in that time horizon. In calculating the distance between the Phaeacians and the Atlantic Ocean, the numbers rule it out. So Strabo stops. He doesn't force it. He sets Ogygia down, in his own words, as something that should be neither examined too rigorously nor dismissed as groundless. Meaning it's pointing at something real, but we can't quite place it. But we have the advantage of 2,000 years of hindsight on our side. So let's see if we could do what Strabo couldn't. Let's attempt to find this using first principles and see if we can boldly assert a new hypothesis. Let's start with the text because Homer gives you more than a story here. He gives you the heading. The first clue is that when Calypso lets Odysseus go, she tells him exactly where to steer. Keep the Great Bear, the one constellation that never sets, on your left. Be sure to watch the Pleiades and watch Boötes. Those constellations never set because they're in the north, which means in order to keep them on your left, the direction of travel must be east. And he is to follow that heading until the mountains of the Phaeacians rise from the sea. And we actually know where the Phaeacians are. It's the island called Scheria, otherwise known as Corfu in modern-day Western Greece. So all we need to do is take that sailing heading and run it backwards. A sailing raft in antiquity could travel anywhere from 1.5 to 2 knots, which equates to about 1,100 to 1,500 kilometers over the course of 17 days. That doesn't get you to the Atlantic Ocean, but it does get you into the southern Mediterranean. And there are several good candidates that fall into that range. You have the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, you have Sicily, you have Malta and Gozo, the sister island to Malta, and many of these locations had been debated throughout antiquity. Callimachus, one of the most learned men in the ancient world and the prime scholar who cataloged and organized the entire library of Alexandria, looked at this same problem 2,300 years ago and said Calypso's island was indeed Gozo. But here's the big problem, and again, it's context. Calypso's island was meant to be hidden. It was mythical. It was beyond the mortal veil. It was a place that was not well traveled, and every single one of these locations was well known in Homer's time. But that's actually where modern research and findings come into play, because maybe there's a third option. And for that, we need to go to Tunisia. Remember when I said the Gulf of Gabes? Look at where this is. This falls right into the location that we just calculated. But not only that, Herodotus places many of his most ancient people groups right next to the Lotus Eaters in that same location. Diodorus also makes the claim that the locals there believed they had the oldest mythology that accounted for all of both the Greek and the Egyptian gods. And finally, Apollonius of Rhodes, a former head librarian at the Library of Alexandria, places Jason and the Argonauts in that exact region. In the 4th book of the Argonautica, Apollonius places Jason and the Argonauts in Libya, specifically in a lake, Lake Tritonis. Lake Tritonis has often been believed to be the Chat el Djerid in Tunisia, a ancient paleo lake that is now a salt flat. What's more, Ptolemy in his geographies gives precise coordinates that within his system mapped to the exact location in Tunisia where the Chat el Djerid sits today. And in the Argonautica, Jason and the Argonauts sail this same vector that Calypso gives Odysseus in order to get back to Greece, which coincidentally was a real ancient seaway based on how the currents travel in that region. And now we must consider the next unit of analysis, the names, because Homer doesn't choose these names by accident. Ogygia. The word means primeval, the oldest, from the dawn of the world. The word itself is tied to Ogyges, a king before the Deucalion flood, and the old writers often used Ogygien to mean anything in the ancient world that they couldn't name. And then there's the goddess Calypso, from the Greek kalypto, to mean to cover, to conceal, to hide. And the ancient lexicon is actually sharper than that. It glosses her name as the one who conceals what is known. She isn't just hiding a man on an island. She's hiding the island's location itself. And she is the daughter of Atlas, the titan who stands at the western edge of the world and holds up the sky. And ironically enough, the Atlas mountain range covers all of northwestern Africa, from Tunisia all the way to the Strait of Gibraltar, otherwise known as the Pillars of Heracles. So let's line it up. Calypso means to hide, to conceal, the daughter of Atlas, which is the mountains that hold up the western edge of the world. Presiding over the location, that is the primeval place. So what could be hidden? Not an island, but the Sahara itself. Or at least what it used to be. And we've touched on this before, but during the African human period, the Sahara was green, rivers, grassland, and water, not oases. There are multiple peer-reviewed papers that talk about rivers and massive paleo lakes, some large enough to contain islands, that sprawled over the entire Sahara Desert. Homer's epic points back to a memory of a Sahara that was once habitable and a prime location for humans to live. The Greek historians were hunting for an island in the middle of the sea, but that island was never in the sea. It was already hidden underneath the sands of the Sahara. But then, following first principles, this actually leaves open another question. The Sahara was already desiccating by the time of Homer, meaning he wouldn't have been able to witness any lakes to attest to them. Which means that if Homer is recording real geography in this story, the knowledge of that geography is older than him. Which means that those who came before him recorded this information for him to preserve. And this is the ultimate purpose of mythology. This is how stories get passed down generation to generation and millennia to millennia. Many of the stories we hear today are echoes of past stories that we've been telling for thousands of years. And as we've shown throughout the conversation, oftentimes these stories are real, pointing at real things, real knowledge, and real locations. Sometimes we just need a bit of modern research data to find the answers. But here's where we need to be disciplined and take one massive step back. Can we say through this little analysis that we found the mythical island of Ogygia? No, probably not. But here's the point. The text gives a real heading to a real coast with a real geography, real history, and real ancient names that map to the specific motifs that Homer employs. The logic that decoded Odysseus' journey at every other stop could still be applied here. And quite possibly the reason it still reads like a fairy tale is because the world it's describing is no longer here. What's changed in our time since Strabo is not that we're more intelligent today. It's that we have access to knowledge that we never had before. The African human period data is little over 50 years old. We're still learning about what that means and what the implications for that knowledge are. And as we do, stories from the past that have been written off as pure mythic fantasy are starting to become more and more plausible. And aside from demonstrating that Homer's Odyssey documented real history and real geographical locations, that's the whole point of this video. Schliemann found Troy because he refused to call the text a liar. So the question I'd carry out of here isn't, what did the ancient writers make up? It's, what are we still calling fiction that's just waiting to be found? I'm Curtis Holland, and I'll see you on the next one.